The morning after the great blizzard of 1868 revealed a landscape of death and impossible survival. When neighbors finally pushed through chest-deep snow to check on the widow Hayes and her daughters, they expected to find bodies beneath collapsed timber. Instead, they found Margaret standing in her doorway, children safe behind her, beneath a structure that defied everything they thought they knew about frontier building. Before we dive into how one widow's strange obsession with a second roof saved her family while neighbors perished, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of frontier survival move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable tale of innovation born from desperation. The snow had stopped falling sometime before dawn on January 6, 1869, but the silence that followed was worse than the storm. Thomas Garrett stood at his cabin door looking across the valley, toward where his neighbors' homesteads should be visible. He saw nothing but white. 3 days of blizzard had transformed the Wisconsin frontier into something unrecognizable. His wife Mary appeared beside him, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Their cabin had survived barely. They had heard the beams groaning under snow wait throughout the third night. Thomas had climbed into the loft twice to push snow off sections of roof from the inside, a desperate and dangerous maneuver that had probably saved their lives. "We need to check on the Hayes woman," Mary said quietly. Margaret Hayes, the widow with 2 young daughters, lived a quarter-mile east. The community had whispered about her chances of surviving the winter alone. A woman without a husband, trying to manage a homestead through Wisconsin winter, seemed doomed from the start. Thomas nodded and began the brutal work of digging a path. The snow reached his chest in places. It took him nearly an hour to travel what normally required minutes of walking. As he crested the small rise that overlooked Margaret's property, he stopped so suddenly that he nearly fell. Her cabin was standing, but that was not what made him freeze. Above her cabin, like some kind of massive wooden umbrella, stood a second roof. A framework of heavy posts surrounded her small log structure, supporting an angled pavilion roof that extended 2 feet beyond her cabin's walls on all sides. Snow had piled on this outer roof in enormous quantities, but the cabin beneath appeared untouched. The design created an air gap between the 2 roofs, and Thomas could see that the outer structure bore the weight, while the inner cabin remained protected. He had seen her building this contraption throughout the previous summer and fall. The entire community had laughed about it. "Widow's folly," they called it, a waste of good lumber and her dead husband's money. Some suggested grief had affected her mind. Now, as Thomas struggled through snow that had killed families across the valley, he stared at Margaret's impossible structure still standing. He heard a door open. Margaret Hayes appeared on her porch, daughters visible behind her in the warm glow of their fireplace. She looked tired, but calm. "Thomas," she called across the snow, "is your family well?" He could not immediately answer. He was trying to understand what he was seeing. The mathematics of it seemed wrong. The weight on that outer roof must be tremendous, yet it stood, while cabins built by experienced men had failed. "The Johnsons," he finally managed. "Have you seen them?" Margaret's face fell. She shook her head slowly. The Johnsons lived between their properties. Thomas knew what her expression meant before she spoke. "Their roof went in the second night," Margaret said quietly. "I heard it collapse. I tried to reach them yesterday morning, but the snow was too deep." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with January wind. Months earlier, in spring of 1867, Margaret Hayes had stood in almost the exact same spot, watching men lower her husband into frozen ground. Thomas Hayes had died doing what frontier men did, cutting timber to expand their homestead, build their future, provide for family. A widowmaker branch, loggers called them, dead wood hanging in the canopy, invisible until it falls. Margaret was 32 years old. Her daughters, Sarah and Emma, were 9 and 7. She owned 160 acres of Wisconsin forest, a small cabin Thomas had built during their first year, some basic tools, and a milk cow. According to conventional frontier wisdom, she had three choices: remarry quickly, return east to family, or fail. The community expected her to choose one of the first two options. At the funeral, several men made offers. John Peterson, a widower with 4 children, proposed marriage within a week of Thomas's burial. He was not unkind about it, simply practical. His children needed a mother. Her daughters needed a father. The mathematics of frontier survival demanded such arrangements. Margaret had thanked him politely and declined. She declined 2 more proposals over the following month. Each refusal generated more community concern and gossip. Women whispered that grief had clouded her judgment. Men suggested she did not understand the realities of homestead life without a husband. But Margaret understood reality better than most suspected. Her father, Jonathan Pierce, had been a bridge engineer in Philadelphia. While other girls learned only domestic skills, Margaret had grown up watching her father calculate load weights and stress distributions. He had taught her mathematics, not because he believed women should enter engineering, but because he enjoyed her quick mind and had no sons. She knew exactly what she faced. A woman alone could not match the physical labor of men. She could not clear land as quickly, could not lift the heaviest. Timbers could not perform all tasks a frontier homestead required. But she also knew that intelligence could sometimes substitute for strength, and that prevention was easier than reaction. Her first winter alone confirmed her worst fears and taught her most important lessons. The cabin Thomas had built was sound by frontier standards: solid logs, decent chinking, a functional roof. But Thomas had always been there to manage snow loads. When heavy snow accumulated, he would climb up and shovel sections clear. It was dangerous work, but necessary. Roofs were built to shed rain, not support hundreds of pounds of compacted snow. Margaret could not safely climb on the roof, especially while caring for 2 young daughters. She tried once in December, nearly fell, and realized she was risking making her children orphans. So she watched from inside as snow piled higher. She listened to beams creak under increasing weight. She lay awake at night, calculating how much load the roof structure could bear before failure. They survived that first winter, but barely. By March, when snow finally melted, Margaret examined her roof and found compression damage to several support beams. The cabin had come closer to collapse than she wanted to admit. If the winter had lasted 2 more weeks, if 1 more heavy snow had fallen, they might have died. That spring, while planting crops and managing daily survival, Margaret began thinking about roof design in ways that would have surprised her Philadelphia father. The winter of 1867 to 1868 was not particularly severe by Wisconsin standards, but for Margaret Hayes, it was a season of education through terror. She learned exactly how much stress a frontier cabin roof could endure, how snow loads increased with each storm, and how helpless a woman alone became when structural failure threatened her children. The first significant snow came in late November, 6 inches overnight, which seemed manageable. Margaret watched it accumulate on her roof and felt relatively calm. Thomas's construction was solid. 6 inches meant perhaps 30 pounds per square foot of additional weight. The roof timbers could handle that easily. But snow did not melt in Wisconsin winter. It accumulated. The second storm added 8 more inches. The third storm brought another 10. By mid-December, nearly 2 feet of compacted snow sat on her roof. Margaret began hearing sounds at night, creaking, settling, the subtle groans of wood under stress. She tried to remove some snow during daylight hours. She fashioned a long pole with a board attached, thinking she could push snow off from ground level. The pole was too short to reach effectively, too unwieldy to control. She tried climbing onto the roof once, got halfway up a ladder while Sarah and Emma watched from the doorway, and realized the absolute stupidity of what she was attempting. If she fell and broke a leg, her daughters would likely freeze or starve before help arrived. So she climbed back down and did the only thing she could do: wait and listen to her cabin struggle under increasing weight. The worst night came in early January. A massive storm dropped 18 inches of heavy, wet snow in less than 12 hours. Margaret lay in bed, daughters sleeping beside her, listening to timbers groan. The sound was not dramatic or sudden. It was subtle, persistent, terrifying. She could hear individual roof beams flexing, could hear snow compressing and settling, could hear wood fibers beginning to fail. She got up 3 times that night to check the ceiling, looking for cracks or sagging. Each time she debated waking the girls and moving them outside into temperatures well below freezing. Each time she decided the immediate danger of cold exposure outweighed the potential danger of roof collapse. Each time she made that decision knowing she might be wrong. Dawn came without collapse. Margaret examined her roof from outside and saw visible sagging in the center ridgeline. The roof had survived, but only just. She understood with absolute clarity that she had been lucky. Another storm like that one, or an even heavier snow load, would exceed her roof's capacity. Most frontier families dealt with this through male labor. Husbands and sons climbed up regularly to clear snow. Neighbors helped each other. But Margaret had no husband. Her daughters were too young, and asking for help repeatedly would mark her as unable to manage her homestead. In frontier culture, that perception could lead to losing her land rights, losing custody of children, losing everything. She needed a solution that did not depend on physical strength she did not possess or community charity she could not rely on. Spring arrived slowly in Wisconsin, retreating and advancing like an uncertain visitor. By late March of 1868, enough snow had melted for Margaret to properly assess winter damage. What she found confirmed her fears. 3 roof beams showed compression damage. The ridgeline had a permanent sag. Her cabin had survived, but another winter, like the last one, would likely kill them. She spent April and May managing the endless work of frontier survival, planting crops, repairing winter damage to fences and outbuildings, caring for livestock, teaching her daughters, preserving food. But throughout those months, her engineer's mind worked on the roof problem. The solution appeared unexpectedly on a cool morning in late May. Margaret was working near their small barn, a structure Thomas had built to shelter their cow and store hay. The barn had a simple gable roof that peaked higher than the cabin. During winter, snow had slid off this barn roof and piled against a lean-to shed Thomas had attached to the barn's south side. Margaret noticed something interesting about that lean-to. Despite being buried under snow that had slid from the barn roof above it, the lean-to's own roof had remained relatively clear. The barn's overhanging roof had created a gap, and snow sliding off the upper roof had somehow protected the lower structure rather than crushing it. She stood there for nearly an hour, studying the relationship between the 2 roofs, understanding what she was seeing. The upper roof bore the weight. The lower roof stayed protected. The gap between them created a buffer zone that prevented direct transfer of snow load. Her father had taught her about load distribution across bridge structures. She understood how weight transferred through support systems, how angles affected force direction, how proper engineering could make relatively light structures bear enormous loads. What she was seeing with the barn and lean-to was accidental engineering, but it was engineering nonetheless. That afternoon, while Sarah and Emma played near the cabin, Margaret sat with paper and pencil, something frontier women rarely did outside of writing letters or keeping household accounts. She began drawing diagrams. If she built a second roof over her cabin, supported by posts that stood independent of the cabin walls, she could create the same protective effect she had observed with the barn. The outer roof would catch snow and bear its weight. The inner cabin roof would stay clear, protected by the gap between structures. The weight would transfer down through the support posts into the ground, completely bypassing her cabin's walls and existing roof structure. It seemed impossible. It seemed wasteful. It seemed exactly like something a widow who did not understand frontier practicality would conceive. But the mathematics worked. She checked her calculations 3 times, using principles her father had taught her about distributed loads and structural stability. The design required 4 heavy posts positioned at the corners of a square larger than her cabin footprint. These posts would support a simple gable roof angled to shed snow. The roof needed to extend beyond the cabin, walls to ensure snow slid clear of the structure. The posts needed to be braced to resist wind. The whole assembly needed to be built with precision to ensure weight distributed evenly. She estimated she would need approximately 20 additional timbers, various hardware, several days of labor, and complete disregard for what her neighbors would think. Margaret walked into Hanson's mill on the first Tuesday of June, 1868, carrying a list written in her careful handwriting. The mill served homesteaders within a 15-mile radius, providing cut lumber and hardware that frontier families could not produce themselves. Henrik Hansen ran the operation with his 2 sons, and the mill served as an unofficial gathering place where men exchanged news and gossip. When Margaret entered, conversation stopped. 3 men stood near the counter. Henrik was reviewing an order with a customer. Everyone turned to look at the widow Hayes, unusual sight in a space that was predominantly male territory. "Mrs. Hayes," Henrik acknowledged her with polite nod. "What can I help you with today?" Margaret approached the counter and handed him her list. Henrik read it, his expression shifting from polite attention to confusion to something resembling concern. "This is a lot of timber," he said slowly. 4 posts, 16 feet long, 12 inches square, ridge beam, 20 feet, rafters, collar ties, bracing. He looked up at her. "What are you building?" "A roof," Margaret said simply. "You need roof repair? I can send my boys to help, no charge for widow." "No, thank you. I need to build a second roof, over my existing cabin." The silence that followed was profound. One of the men by the door actually laughed, then caught himself and tried to turn it into a cough. Henrik's face showed genuine confusion. "A second roof? I do not understand. Your cabin has a roof, yes?" "Thomas built good roof." "My cabin has a roof," Margaret confirmed. "I need another one above it, a protective structure. It will be supported by independent posts, creating an air gap between the 2 roof systems." Henrik looked at her list again, then at her face, clearly trying to determine if this was some kind of joke or if grief had affected her mind. "Mrs. Hayes, forgive me, but this makes no sense. Why would anyone build 2 roofs? This is expensive, wasteful. Your cabin roof works fine." "The snow load last winter nearly collapsed my cabin," Margaret said evenly. "I cannot safely climb on the roof to clear snow. I need a system that protects my cabin without requiring me to perform work I cannot physically do." One of the men spoke up. "So hire someone to clear your snow, or remarry. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but building double roofs is crazy talk." Margaret turned to look at him. "I am not asking your opinion. I am ordering lumber." Henrik set down her list and leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to something like fatherly concern. "Mrs. Hayes, I knew Thomas, good man. He would not want you wasting money on foolish projects. This lumber costs real money. Your girls need food, clothing, future security, not second roofs that serve no purpose." "The purpose is keeping my children alive through winter," Margaret said. Her voice remained calm, but something in her tone made Henrik step back slightly. "Can you fill this order, or should I ride to the mill in Greenville?" Greenville was 2 days' travel. Everyone knew she would not actually make that journey. But Henrik also knew he could not refuse a paying customer without cause. Henrik Hansen filled Margaret's order, though he did so with visible reluctance and multiple warnings about wasted money. By the time she loaded the first delivery of timber onto her small wagon, half the settlement knew about the widow's foolish project. Within a week, it became the primary topic of conversation at Sunday church gatherings and evening visits between homesteads. What the community did not know, what Margaret never mentioned, was that she possessed knowledge most frontier women lacked entirely. Her father, Jonathan Pierce, had not simply been a bridge engineer. He had been one of Philadelphia's most respected structural designers, responsible for 3 major railway bridges and numerous commercial buildings. He had died when Margaret was 19, but by then he had taught her things that would have shocked her neighbors. She understood calculus, though she would never mention it. She knew how to calculate load distribution across multiple support points. She comprehended the relationship between angle, weight, and structural stress. She had watched her father design bridges that carried locomotives weighing tens of thousands of pounds across spans that seemed impossibly delicate. A second roof over a frontier cabin was, by comparison, a simple problem. Margaret spent 3 evenings working through calculations by candlelight after her daughters slept. She measured her cabin, precisely 18 feet long, 14 feet wide, with existing roof peak at 12 feet height. She estimated Wisconsin's snow loads based on last winter's accumulation, potentially 3 feet of wet snow, weighing approximately 15 to 20 pounds per cubic foot when compacted. Her existing cabin roof measured roughly 400 square feet of surface area. 3 feet of compacted snow at 18 pounds per cubic foot meant her roof might need to support nearly 11,000 pounds during severe storms. Thomas had built adequately for normal conditions, but not for worst-case scenarios. The sagging and compression damage proved that. Her solution involved building a pavilion-style roof structure with peak at 16 feet extending 2 feet beyond her cabin walls on all sides. This created approximately 600 square feet of roof surface on the outer structure. The larger surface area and steeper pitch would shed snow more effectively. More importantly, the weight would transfer down through 4 independent posts anchored in the ground, completely bypassing her cabin's existing structure. Each post needed to potentially bear 3,000 pounds. She selected 12-inch square timbers for this purpose, knowing that pine of that dimension could handle far more than 3,000 pounds compression load if properly installed. The posts would be set 3 feet deep in the ground, below frost line, anchored with rocks and tamped earth. The engineering was sound. She knew it with the same certainty she knew that 2 plus 2 equaled 4. But knowing and proving were different things, and the frontier respected results, not theory. She also knew something else. Her neighbor's mockery was not entirely about the second roof. It was about a woman acting independently, making decisions traditionally reserved for men, spending money without male approval, and demonstrating knowledge that challenged assumptions about female capability. Margaret accepted this reality. She would build her structure, it would work, and eventually people would either understand or they would not. Her daughter's survival mattered more than community opinion. The first timber delivery arrived on June 15th. Margaret began work the following morning, starting before dawn when air was cool and her daughters still slept. She had recruited Sarah and Emma to help with tasks they could manage, holding measuring strings, fetching tools, keeping water buckets filled. They approached it as adventure rather than labor, which made the work easier. The mockery began almost immediately. Her nearest neighbor, John Peterson, the widower who had proposed marriage, walked over that first morning ostensibly to check on her welfare. He found Margaret digging post holes, using a spade and iron bar to break through root systems and rocky soil. "Margaret," he said, and she heard the carefully controlled patience in his voice. "What are you doing?" "Digging post. Holes," she replied without stopping work. The hole was already 2 feet deep. She needed 3 feet minimum, and the soil was fighting her. For this second roof business, it was statement, not question. Yes. John Peterson was not a cruel man. He was 43 years old, weathered by frontier life, practical to his core. He watched her work for a long moment before speaking again. "This is foolishness. You know that, right? You are spending money and time on something that makes no sense." Margaret stopped digging and straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. "John, I appreciate your concern, but I have made my decision. Your daughters need a father, a proper home, security. Instead, you dig holes for a second roof nobody needs. My daughters need to survive winter. This will help ensure that." He shook his head slowly. "You think you are smarter than everyone else? Smarter than men who have built cabins and survived winters for years?" Margaret considered her response carefully. "I think I have a different problem than most men. I cannot climb on my roof to clear snow. I need a solution that accounts for my limitations." "The solution is accepting help or remarrying. I have chosen a different solution." John Peterson left, shaking his head. He stopped at 2 other homesteads on his way home, spreading the story of the widow digging holes for her crazy roof project. By evening, Margaret's foolishness was confirmed fact across the settlement. But Margaret kept digging. The first post hole took her all day. Her hands blistered despite gloves. Her back ached. Sarah brought her water and bread at midday. Emma sang songs to keep her company. When the hole finally reached 3 feet depth, Margaret felt both exhaustion and satisfaction. 3 more holes to go. The second hole went faster because she learned technique. Loosen soil with the iron bar, scoop it out with the spade, work in sections rather than trying to dig the full circumference at once. She finished it in 7 hours. By the end of the first week, all 4 post holes were complete. Margaret had also endured visits from 3 different neighbors, all expressing various degrees of concern, mockery, or outright criticism. Mary Garrett suggested that Margaret's judgment had been impaired by grief. Henrik Hansen's wife mentioned that perhaps Margaret should pray for guidance. A traveling preacher who stopped at the settlement specifically sought her out to discuss the sin of pride. Margaret listened politely to each visitor, thanked them for their concern, and continued working. Installing the posts required help. Margaret knew this from her calculations. Each 12-inch square timber, 16 feet long, weighed approximately 380 pounds. She could not lift that alone, could not position it accurately, could not hold it vertical while backfilling the hole. She considered her options for 2 days. Asking for community help would invite more mockery and would create social debt she might not want to repay. Hiring help cost money she needed to conserve, but she also could not build her structure without getting those posts vertical and secure. The solution appeared in the form of Jacob Mueller, a 71-year-old German immigrant who had homesteaded in the area for nearly 20 years. Jacob was a retired carpenter who had built furniture in Milwaukee before deciding he preferred frontier solitude to city noise. He walked slowly due to an old injury but retained sharp eyes and steady hands. He appeared at Margaret's cabin on a Tuesday morning in late June, carrying his own tools. "I help you with posts," he announced without preamble. "These idiots in settlement talk and talk. I prefer to see what you actually build." Margaret had not asked for his help, but she recognized both the offer and the risk Jacob was taking. Helping her meant facing the same mockery she endured. "I cannot pay much," she said honestly. "I do not want money. I want to see if your idea works. Also, my wife makes too much food and insists I bring you soup." He held up a covered pot. They installed the first post that afternoon. The process required careful coordination. Jacob helped Margaret position the timber over the hole. They used ropes and a simple lever system to tilt it upward, and Margaret guided it into place while Jacob stabilized it with bracing boards. Once vertical, they checked plumb with a level Jacob had brought, made minute adjustments, then backfilled the hole with rocks and tamped earth. The post stood perfectly vertical, solid as bedrock. Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction seeing her calculations transform into physical reality. "Your father taught you this?" Jacob asked, studying her measurement marks and the precision of her work. "He taught me many things. Good things to know, especially for woman alone." He said it without judgment, simple statement of fact. They installed the remaining 3 posts over. The next 4 days. Jacob appeared each morning, worked until afternoon heat became oppressive, then returned to his own homestead. He asked questions about her design, listened to her explanations of load distribution and weight transfer, and occasionally offered suggestions based on his carpentry experience. By July 7th, 4 posts stood at the corners of a 22 by 18-foot rectangle surrounding Margaret's cabin with 2 feet of clearance on all sides. Each post was perfectly vertical, properly braced with diagonal supports anchored deep enough to resist frost heave and wind stress. The settlement's reaction to Jacob's assistance was predictable. He faced questions about why he was helping the widow waste her resources. He responded by telling people to mind their own business, which only increased gossip. But the posts stood, undeniable and solid, evidence that Margaret's project was progressing beyond mere talk. With posts installed, Margaret began the next phase, constructing the actual roof framework above her cabin. This required even more precision than the post installation. The ridge beam needed to span 22 feet between the front and back pairs of posts, positioned at exactly 16 feet height. The rafters needed to be cut at precise angles to create proper pitch for snow shedding. Every connection point needed to be strong enough to transfer thousands of pounds of load. Jacob continued helping, though less frequently now. His assistance came primarily in the form of guidance rather than labor. He showed Margaret how to cut rafter angles using techniques he had learned in his Milwaukee furniture shop. He explained how to create strong connections using mortise and tenon joints rather than simply nailing pieces together. He taught her tricks for working with heavy timbers that made the labor manageable for someone with her strength limitations. But the design was entirely Margaret's. She had sketched it on paper dozens of times, calculated every dimension, verified every angle. Now she transformed those calculations into wood and iron. The ridge beam was the critical element. 22 feet long, 10 inches by 12 inches in cross-section, it would form the peak of her pavilion roof and bear the downward force of all the rafters. Installing it required ingenuity. Margaret designed a temporary scaffolding system using smaller timbers and rope pulleys. With Sarah and Emma helping to pull ropes and Jacob guiding placement, they raised the massive beam to its position atop the posts. Securing it required custom iron brackets that Margaret had commissioned from the settlement's blacksmith. The blacksmith, a taciturn Swede named Lars, had made the brackets with obvious skepticism but undeniable skill. Each bracket weighed 15 pounds and featured bolt holes precisely positioned to match Margaret's specifications. When the ridge beam was finally bolted into place, level and secure, Margaret allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. The most critical structural element was installed. Everything else would build from this foundation. The rafters went up next. Margaret cut them in pairs, ensuring matching angles. Each rafter was 8 feet long, notched where it would sit on the top of the side posts, angled to meet its opposite partner at the ridge beam. Jacob taught her how to cut bird's mouth notches that would lock each rafter securely to the post top while transferring weight downward rather than creating outward thrust. It was technical work, requiring mathematical precision and careful measurement. Margaret discovered she enjoyed it. There was something deeply satisfying about translating numbers on paper into physical structures that fit together with exactness. Her daughters watched the framework grow, asking endless questions. Why did the angles have to be exact? How did weight move through the wood? Why were some pieces bigger than others? Margaret answered each question, teaching them the same principles her father had taught her. The settlement watched, too, though with different reactions. Some neighbors had moved beyond mockery to genuine curiosity. How was the widow actually building this thing? Where had she learned such skills? Others remained convinced she was wasting resources on foolishness. But even skeptics had to admit the structure was taking shape with surprising competence. By late July, the basic framework stood complete. 4 posts, ridge beam, rafters, collar ties connecting opposite rafters to prevent spreading. The skeleton of a pavilion roof hovered above Margaret's cabin like a protective cage. August brought scorching heat and the relentless work of completing the roof structure. Margaret needed to install sheathing boards across the rafters, then shingle the entire surface to create actual weather protection. This meant working on a structure 16 feet above ground, balancing on rafters while handling heavy materials. She built a simple but effective scaffolding system, learning as she progressed. Jakob visited once a week now. His role shifted from assistant to consultant. He would examine her work, point out potential improvements, then leave her to implement them. Margaret appreciated this approach. It allowed her to maintain ownership of the project while benefiting from his experience. The sheathing boards went up slowly. Each board needed to be measured, cut, and nailed to the rafters with precision. Margaret worked in early morning and late evening when temperatures were bearable. Midday heat made labor dangerous, especially at height. Sarah and Emma helped by hauling materials and tools. At 9 and 7, they were old enough to understand the importance of what their mother was building. They had lived through the terrifying nights of last winter, hearing beams groan, sensing their mother's fear even when she tried to hide it. This strange second roof represented safety, even if they could not fully articulate why. By mid-August, the sheathing was complete. The structure now had a solid roof surface, though still unprotected from weather. Margaret examined her work critically, checking each connection, testing the stability of the entire assembly. Everything appeared sound. The framework distributed weight exactly as her calculations predicted. The posts stood firm. The roof was level and properly angled. Shingling came next, a tedious process that required patience and attention to detail. Margaret had purchased cedar shingles from Hanson's mill, enduring Henrik's continued disapproval of her expenditures. She installed them in overlapping rows, working from bottom to top, ensuring water would shed properly. Jacob appeared one afternoon in late August and climbed up to examine her shingle work. He inspected several rows carefully, checking overlap and nail placement. "You do good work," he finally said. "Better than many men I have known. My father taught me that. Anything worth doing deserved full attention," Margaret replied. "Smart man, your father. What did he do?" "He built bridges. In Philadelphia." Jacob nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "Ah, this explains much. You are not guessing. You know." "I know the mathematics. Whether the structure works as intended, we will see this winter. It will work. I have built many things in my life. I recognize good engineering." The shingling was completed in the first week of September. The final step involved installing fascia boards along the roof edges and ensuring all gaps were properly sealed. Margaret worked with meticulous care, knowing that any weakness in weather protection would undermine the entire structure's effectiveness. On September 9, 1868, Margaret installed the final piece, a small decorative finial at the peak of the ridge beam. It served no structural purpose, but she had carved it herself during evening hours, shaping it into a simple, pine cone design. It was her signature on the work, her statement that this structure was not just functional but intentional. She climbed down from the scaffolding that afternoon and stood back to view the completed pavilion roof. It stood solid and clean, a geometric framework surrounding her cabin, creating defined space between inner and outer roofs. The structure looked unusual, certainly. It challenged conventional cabin design, but it also looked purposeful and well-built. Jakob came by that evening with his wife, Anna, who had insisted on seeing the finished structure. They walked around the entire perimeter, examining it from all angles. "The neighbors still talk," Anna said quietly. "They say you are foolish." "Let them talk," Jakob replied. "When winter comes, we will see who is foolish." Margaret smiled slightly. "Would you like to stay for dinner? I have venison stew, and the girls would enjoy the company." They stayed until after dark, and for those few hours Margaret felt something she had not experienced since Thomas died, the simple pleasure of friendship without judgment. November arrived with unseasonable warmth, delaying winter's arrival and giving Margaret additional time to prepare. She spent those extra weeks stockpiling firewood in the protected space beneath her pavilion roof, organizing supplies and making minor adjustments to her structure. The air gap between the two roofs created an unexpected benefit, a sheltered area where she could store items that needed protection from direct weather but did not require indoor space. She stacked cordwood against the cabin's exterior walls, beneath the overhanging outer roof. This positioned fuel within easy reach of her door while keeping it dry. She hung herbs and preserved vegetables from hooks attached to the underside of the pavilion rafters. The protected space became an extension of her limited cabin interior, increasing her functional living area without requiring additional construction. The settlement watched these developments with continued skepticism mixed with grudging curiosity. Some neighbors admitted privately that the pavilion structure at least provided useful storage space, even if the concept of a second roof remained questionable. Others maintained that Margaret had wasted resources on an elaborate solution to a problem that did not require solving. The first snow fell on November 19th. Margaret woke before dawn to find 3 inches of white covering everything. Her daughters pressed their faces against the cabin window, delighted by the transformation of their familiar world. Margaret felt a different emotion, anxious anticipation. She dressed warmly and went outside to observe. Snow covered both her cabin's original roof and the pavilion roof above it. From ground level, she could see the gap between the two structures, could see that the outer roof now bore weight, while her cabin roof remained distinct beneath it. She walked the perimeter slowly, studying how snow had accumulated. The pavilion's steeper pitch already showed slight sliding, where the warmth of the day before had created a thin melt layer. The design was working exactly as intended. Snow rested on the outer structure, not on her cabin. Jacob Muller appeared around midday, trudging through the light accumulation. "First test," he said simply, looking up at the double roof system. "First test," Margaret agreed. They stood together in silence, watching. The snow was light and fluffy, barely any weight to it. This was not a real test of the structure's capacity, merely a preliminary confirmation that the basic concept functioned. By evening, another 2 inches had fallen. Margaret went outside after dark with a lantern and examined the structure again. She could see clear definition between the two roofs. The pavilion bore the load. Her cabin remained protected beneath it. She slept well that night for the first time since the previous winter's terror. The snow melted within 3 days, but it had proven something important. The structure worked in principle. Now they needed to wait for a true test, heavy, wet snow under sustained winter conditions. December brought cold that settled over Wisconsin like a physical presence. Temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there. Margaret prepared her household for winter's siege, knowing that this season would determine whether her unconventional solution would save her daughters or prove the community's mockery justified. She was ready. The question was whether her mathematics and engineering would translate into actual survival when nature delivered its worst. December of 1868 brought omens that worried the settlement's oldest residents. The cold arrived early and intense. Ice formed on the creek by the 10th of the month, 2 weeks earlier than normal. Animals behaved strangely. Deer congregated in larger herds than usual. Squirrels gathered food with unusual urgency. Birds that normally lingered into winter departed early for southern territories. Old Hans Bergstrom, who had lived in Wisconsin for 43 years, mentioned to anyone who would listen that the signs reminded him of the winter of 1843. That year had brought blizzards that killed livestock, collapsed buildings, and left homesteaders isolated for weeks. Settlers still spoke of that winter in hushed tones, the way people referenced catastrophes that defined an era. Margaret heard these warnings and intensified her preparations. She purchased additional salt and flour from the general store, spending money carefully but without hesitation. She slaughtered one of her 2 pigs earlier than planned, preserving the meat in the cold air beneath her pavilion roof. She mended every piece of clothing her daughters owned and sewed additional quilts from fabric scraps. The settlement's attitude toward her had shifted subtly over the fall months. The outright mockery had diminished, replaced by a kind of watchful waiting. People were curious now. Would the widow's strange roof actually protect her cabin during serious winter conditions? Some hoped it would work, if only to validate their own curiosity. Others remained convinced it would fail, proving that traditional methods existed for good reasons. Margaret cared little about community opinion. She focused on practical matters: food stores, fuel supplies, maintaining her livestock, keeping her daughters healthy and educated during the long months ahead. The first significant storm arrived on December 23rd. Margaret woke to wind howling around the cabin and snow falling in sheets so thick she could barely see her woodpile 10 feet away. The storm lasted 2 days, dropping 16 inches of heavy, wet snow. When it finally cleared on Christmas morning, Wisconsin was transformed into a landscape of white silence. Margaret bundled her daughters and ventured outside to assess the situation. The pavilion roof bore enormous weight. She estimated 8 to 10 inches of compacted snow across the entire surface, probably 400 pounds per square foot of load. The structure stood absolutely solid. No sagging, no creaking, no sign of stress. More importantly, her cabin's original roof beneath the pavilion remained nearly clear. Some snow had sifted through the gap between structures, perhaps an inch or two, but nothing compared to the load the outer roof bore. Margaret could have easily cleared that minimal accumulation from inside using a broom through the loft opening. Jacob Mueller arrived on December 26th, having dug his way through drifts to check on her. He stood looking at her structure for a long moment before speaking. "It works," he said simply. "It works," Margaret agreed. "The Johnsons have 4 inches of snow on their cabin roof. The Garretts have 6. You have almost nothing." He paused. "You were right. Everyone else was wrong." Margaret did not feel vindicated so much as relieved. One storm proved the concept, but winter had months remaining. The real test would come if multiple storms accumulated, if temperatures stayed cold enough to prevent melting between weather systems, if snow loads reached the extreme levels her calculations had anticipated. The week following Christmas brought clear skies and bitter cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero on several nights. Margaret kept her cabin warm, burning through firewood at a steady rate, but not excessively. The pavilion roof, she discovered, provided unexpected insulation benefits. The air gap between roofs created a buffer zone that reduced heat loss through her cabin ceiling. On New Year's Eve, the settlement held a small gathering at the church. Margaret attended with her daughters, the first social event she had participated in since completing her roof structure. The reception was markedly different from what she had experienced during the summer and fall. Several women approached her with genuine curiosity rather than veiled criticism. How had she learned to build such a structure? Was it difficult work? Did it really keep snow off her cabin roof? Margaret answered questions politely, explaining the basic principles without revealing the depth of engineering knowledge her father had provided. John Peterson, the widower who had proposed marriage, sought her out specifically. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I thought you were being foolish. I was wrong." "You were concerned for my welfare," Margaret replied. "I took no offense. Still, I should have trusted that you knew what you were doing." He hesitated, then continued. "My roof is sagging. I can hear it at night. I should have built something like yours." "The winter is not over," Margaret said. "You should clear your roof when you can, and perhaps next summer we can discuss how the pavilion structure works." Other men had similar conversations with her, expressing grudging respect or outright admiration. Margaret accepted their changed attitudes without gloating. She had not built her structure to prove anything to the community. She had built it to keep her children alive. The first week of January brought calm weather and pale sunshine. Sarah and Emma played outside, building snow structures in the protected area beneath the pavilion roof. They created elaborate snow sculptures, animals, castles, and geometric shapes. The overhang kept fresh snow from destroying their work, allowing them to build projects that lasted days instead of being buried by the next storm. Margaret watched her daughters play and felt a contentment she had not experienced since Thomas died. They were safe. They were warm. They had sufficient food. Her unconventional solution had provided security that traditional methods could not have offered a woman alone. On the afternoon of January 2nd, Jakob Mueller stopped by with news from the settlement. "Hans, Bergstrom says another storm is coming. Big one. He can feel it in his bones, and his bones are never wrong." Margaret looked at the sky. It appeared clear, but she had learned to trust the intuition of people who had survived decades of Wisconsin winters. "When?" "Tomorrow, he thinks. Maybe next day, but coming soon and coming hard." Margaret spent that evening and the following day checking every aspect of her preparations. She brought additional firewood inside, filling every available space. She filled water buckets from the creek before it could become inaccessible. She inventoried food supplies and confirmed they had sufficient resources for an extended storm. The barometric pressure dropped dramatically on the afternoon of January 3rd. The air became absolutely still, the kind of eerie calm that precedes violent weather. Margaret brought her milk cow into the small shelter she had constructed adjacent to the cabin within the pavilion's protected area. She secured everything that could blow away. She closed and barred the shutters on her cabin windows. At sunset, the first snowflakes began falling. Within an hour, it was a blizzard. The storm that struck on January 3rd, 1869, exceeded anything Margaret had anticipated in her calculations. It exceeded anything Hans Bergstrom remembered from the catastrophic winter of 1843. It was the kind of weather event that occurs perhaps once in a generation, the kind that reshapes communities and kills the unprepared. The snow began gently, almost deceptively, light flakes drifting down in the still air, but within 2 hours the wind rose to a howl, and visibility dropped to nothing. Margaret stood at her cabin window, watching the white chaos outside, unable to see her woodpile 15 feet away. She had prepared well. The cabin was secure, warm, and well stocked. Sarah and Emma seemed more excited than frightened initially, treating the storm as an adventure. But as the wind intensified and the cabin trembled slightly under sustained gusts, their excitement shifted to nervous energy. "Will we be safe, Mama?" Emma asked, her 7-year-old voice small in the storm's roar. "We will be safe," Margaret assured her, projecting confidence she genuinely felt. Her structure was engineered for exactly this scenario. The mathematics were sound. The construction was solid. They would survive. The first night of the blizzard was an exercise in endurance. The wind never stopped, a constant pressure against the cabin walls. Margaret could hear the storm interacting with her pavilion roof, wind streaming over the angled surface, snow accumulating, the entire structure bearing loads that would have destroyed a standard cabin. But she heard no cracking, no groaning, no sounds of structural distress. The 4 posts stood firm. The roof framework held. The weight transferred down through the support system exactly as designed. By dawn of January 4th, the storm had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified. Margaret could not see anything beyond her windows except white. The temperature inside the cabin remained comfortable despite the savage conditions outside. Her careful chinking and the insulating effect of the double roof system kept them warm. The second day brought a new challenge: isolation-induced anxiety. Sarah and Emma were active children, accustomed to playing outside even in winter. Being confined to the cabin's small space with nothing visible beyond the windows created tension. Margaret kept them occupied with lessons, games, stories, and small tasks. She rationed candles carefully, knowing they might need to extend supplies if the storm lasted longer than anticipated. The blizzard continued without pause through the second night. Margaret slept in shifts, waking periodically to maintain the fire and check conditions. Each time she woke, the storm raged unchanged. Snow piled against the cabin walls, drifting in some areas, creating a landscape that buried familiar landmarks. On the third day, January 5th, Margaret heard something that turned her blood cold. A distant crashing sound muffled by wind and snow, but unmistakable. Something large had collapsed. She stood at the window, straining to see anything through the white chaos, but visibility remained zero. An hour later, another crash, then another. Margaret knew what those sounds meant. Somewhere in the settlement, cabins were failing under snow loads that exceeded their structural capacity. Roofs were collapsing, and with roofs went survival. Families caught beneath collapsing timber, and snow faced death from crushing injury, exposure, or both. She pulled Sarah and Emma close, held them tight, and listened to her own roof system bearing the weight above them with steady, silent strength. The pavilion structure did not waver. The posts did not shift. The mathematics that her father had taught her, the calculations she had performed by candlelight, the design that her neighbors had mocked, was doing exactly what she had intended. It was keeping her children alive while others died. The third night of the blizzard brought sounds that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. The wind had finally begun to diminish slightly, enough that individual noises carried across the snow-buried landscape. She heard at least 4 distinct crashes between midnight and dawn, each one representing catastrophic structural failure somewhere in the settlement. Sarah and Emma slept fitfully, waking at each sound. Margaret held them close, whispering reassurances while her own heart raced with survivor's dread. She knew those crashes meant death. Frontier cabins housed entire families. When a roof collapsed under tons of compacted snow, there was rarely time to escape. The weight came down with devastating speed, crushing everything beneath it. She tried to calculate which cabins might have failed based on the direction and distance of sounds, but the storm distorted everything. Was that crash the Johnsons a quarter-mile east, the Garretts to the north, the Andersons or the Schmidts or any of the dozen families scattered across the settlement? Her own cabin remained absolutely secure. The pavilion roof bore weight that must have exceeded 2,000 pounds by now. Snow had accumulated in massive quantities over 3 days of sustained blizzard, yet her structure stood without complaint. The air gap between roofs remained clear. Her cabin's original roof carried almost no load. Margaret understood the terrible irony of her situation. She had built this structure to protect her daughters, driven by the specific vulnerability of being a woman alone who could not climb on roofs to clear snow. That same structure was now saving them while neighbors who had mocked her foolishness died beneath their conventional cabins. She felt no satisfaction in being right, only horror at the cost of others' skepticism. The wind finally died completely around dawn on January 6th. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Margaret waited until full light before venturing to open her door. Snow had drifted against it, and she had to push hard to create an opening. The world beyond was unrecognizable. Snow had transformed the familiar landscape into something alien. Drifts rose higher than her head in places. Trees were buried to their lower branches. The sky was clear and painfully blue, offering crystalline visibility across a scene of white devastation. Margaret could see Jacob Mueller's cabin in the distance. It stood intact, smoke rising from the chimney. Relief flooded through her. Jacob and Anna had survived. But looking further, she saw what she had feared. The Johnson cabin, visible as a dark shape against white snow, had collapsed. The roof had caved inward, leaving only partial walls standing. She pulled the door closed and leaned against it, breathing hard. The Johnsons had 3 children, young children, the same ages as her daughters. Sarah appeared at her side. "Mama, what is wrong?" Margaret knelt and pulled both girls close. Some of our neighbors did not survive the storm. Their cabins were not strong enough. But we are safe? Emma asked, her voice very small. We are safe. Our cabin protected us exactly as it was meant to do. Margaret spent that morning doing what needed to be done despite her emotional devastation. She dug a path to her livestock shelter, verified that her cow had survived, provided feed and water. She cleared snow from around her door and windows. She assessed her own structure for any damage and found none. The pavilion roof had performed flawlessly. Around midday, she saw movement in the distance. Jakob Muller was attempting to reach her, struggling through chest-deep snow. Margaret grabbed a shovel and began digging a path to meet him. They connected halfway between their properties, both breathing hard from exertion. Jacob's face was gray with grief. The Johnsons are dead, all of them. Roof collapsed in the night. Thomas Garrett went to check on them this morning and found them. Margaret had known, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach clench. Who else? The Andersons, the Schmidt family. Maybe others we have not reached yet. The snow is too deep. We cannot get to all the cabins. Your family? We are well. Our cabin held. He looked at Margaret's structure, the massive pavilion roof still bearing tons of snow without visible stress. Yours held too. It held. They stood in silence for a moment, two survivors in a landscape of death, before Jacob spoke again. When this melts, when we can move freely, people will want to know how you built this. They will want to build the same. I will teach anyone who asks, Margaret said quietly. I will teach them everything my father taught me. The full scope of the catastrophe revealed itself slowly over the following week as settlers dug through snow to reach isolated homesteads. The Great Blizzard of 1869 had killed 13 people across their settlement alone. 3 entire families had perished when roofs collapsed. 2 elderly couples had frozen to death when their inadequate cabins lost heat after structural damage. A single man had died attempting to reach his barn during the storm's height. The settlement held a mass burial on January 15th. The ground was frozen solid, so men worked in shifts for 3 days to dig graves deep enough. Margaret attended with Sarah and Emma, standing among survivors who looked at her with expressions ranging from grief to something uncomfortably close to resentment. She understood that resentment. Her unorthodox structure had saved her family while their conventional cabins had killed theirs. Some people would always wonder if Margaret Hayes, a widow with no formal training, could build something that survived. Why had their husbands and fathers not done the same? The Ponte answer was complicated and painful. Traditional frontier cabin construction had worked adequately for generations. Most winters did not bring storms severe enough to cause catastrophic failures. The blizzard of 1869 was an outlier, the kind of event that could not be predicted or prepared for using conventional wisdom, except Margaret had prepared for it, not because she was smarter than everyone else, but because she had faced a different problem that required a different solution. Her inability to climb on roofs and clear snow had forced her to engineer a system that did not require active intervention. That system had incidentally protected against extreme loads that would have destroyed standard construction. After the burial service, Thomas Garrett approached her. His cabin had survived, but his wife Mary had been Margaret's closest friend among the settlement women. Mary stood beside him, her face hollow with grief for their lost neighbors. "We need to talk," Thomas said. "About your roof? About how you built it?" "Of course," Margaret replied. Over the next week, Margaret received visits from every surviving family in the settlement. Men came with paper and pencils, asking for diagrams and measurements. Women came asking how she had learned such things, whether their husbands could replicate her design. Jakob Muller sat in on most of these conversations, adding his carpenter's perspective to Margaret's engineering explanations. She shared everything freely: the mathematics of load distribution, the importance of independent support posts that did not transfer weight to cabin walls, the value of air gaps for insulation and snow management, the need for proper angles to encourage snow shedding. She drew diagrams, calculated dimensions for different cabin sizes, explained which materials were critical and which could be modified based on available resources. Some men struggled to understand the underlying principles. They wanted simple instructions. Cut this, nail that, done. But Margaret insisted they understand the why behind each element. If you do not understand the principles, you cannot adapt when circumstances change. You cannot fix problems when they arise. You must understand how the structure works, not just how to build it. Henrik Hansen, who had sold her lumber while questioning her judgment, visited specifically to apologize. "I was wrong about your project. I thought you were wasting money. I am sorry." "You could not have known," Margaret said. "None of us could predict a storm that severe, but you prepared for it anyway." "I prepared for the worst case I could imagine. That is what my father taught me. Engineer for failure scenarios, not just normal conditions." By early February, as snow finally began to melt and the settlement started rebuilding, Margaret's role in the community had transformed completely. The widow, who had been mocked for her foolish second roof, had become the authority people, consulted about structural design and winter survival. She found herself in an unexpected position, teaching grown men skills that challenged their assumptions about capability and knowledge. Some accepted her instruction with genuine humility. Others struggled with the reality that a woman understood engineering principles they had never considered. But grief and fear proved powerful motivators. The blizzard had killed their neighbors. They would do whatever necessary to prevent similar catastrophes. Thomas Garrett was the first to begin construction of what people were now calling a Hayes-style pavilion roof. He started in mid-February, working carefully from Margaret's diagrams. She visited his property several times to answer questions and verify that his implementation matched the structural principles. "The posts need to be deeper," she told him on her second visit, examining his foundation work. "You are in lower ground than I am, more moisture, more frost heave potential. Go another 6 inches down." Thomas had already spent a full day digging his post holes through frozen earth. 6 more inches meant hours of additional brutal labor, but he nodded and picked up his iron bar without complaint. "You are right. I will dig deeper." By March, 5 families were building Hayes-style roofs. By April, it was 8. Some built complete pavilion structures, like Margaret's. Others created modified versions adapted to their specific situations. A few built hybrid systems that incorporated her principles of weight distribution and air gaps while maintaining different aesthetics. Jakob Muller organized informal work parties where men helped each other with the heaviest construction tasks. Margaret attended these gatherings, offering guidance and answering technical questions. Her daughters came with her, watching their mother teach grown men about load calculations and structural engineering. Sarah, now 10 years old, began asking her own questions about the mathematics involved. Margaret taught her the same principles her father had taught her, seeing in Sarah's quick mind an echo of her own childhood fascination with how things worked. The settlement's attitude toward women's capabilities shifted subtly but unmistakably. If Margaret Hayes could engineer structures that saved lives, what else might women be capable of given knowledge and opportunity? It was a dangerous question in a culture built on rigid gender roles, but the blizzard had cracked something open that would not easily close. In May, Margaret received an unexpected visitor, a journalist from Milwaukee named Robert Chandler. He had heard about the settlement's catastrophic blizzard and the widow's miraculous structure. He wanted to write about it for his newspaper. Margaret was reluctant initially, uncomfortable with publicity, but Jacob convinced her that sharing her story more broadly could save lives beyond their immediate community. Other settlements will face severe winters. Other women will be alone. Your knowledge should spread. She agreed to the interview. Chandler spent 2 days in the settlement talking to survivors, examining Margaret's structure, documenting the construction techniques. His article appeared in the Milwaukee Sentinel on June 3, 1869, under the headline, Widow's engineering genius saves family while neighbors perish. The article brought additional attention. Engineers from Milwaukee and Chicago wrote to Margaret requesting more detailed specifications. Other frontier communities sent representatives to examine her structure and learn her techniques. The Wisconsin Territorial Legislature even invited her to present her designs to a committee studying frontier building standards. Margaret declined the legislative invitation, uncomfortable with that level of public attention, but she continued sharing her knowledge freely with anyone who asked, believing that her father's engineering principles deserved wider application than his Philadelphia bridges. Margaret Hayes remarried in the spring of 1871, 3 years after building her pavilion roof. She married Henrik Hansen's eldest son, Carl, a quiet man who had helped her obtain lumber despite his father's initial skepticism. Carl had learned carpentry skills from his father and engineering principles from Margaret, becoming one of the settlement's most skilled builders. They combined their homesteads and built a larger house, naturally incorporating a Hayes-style pavilion roof in the design. Sarah and Emma gained a stepfather who treated them with genuine kindness and encouraged their education. Margaret had 2 more children, sons born in 1872 and 1874, but her legacy extended far beyond her own family. By 1875, Hayes-style pavilion roofs had become standard construction across Wisconsin's northern settlements. The design spread to Minnesota, Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and parts of the Dakota Territories. Anywhere heavy snow threatened frontier structures, people built Margaret's double roof systems. The specific implementations varied. Some builders created elaborate structures with decorative elements. Others built minimal versions focusing purely on function, but all incorporated the core principles Margaret had pioneered: independent support posts, proper load distribution, air gaps for insulation, and angles calculated to shed snow efficiently. Lives were saved. During the severe winter of 1876 to 77, multiple settlements reported that Hayes-style roofs prevented casualties during storms that would have previously caused widespread structural failures. Families survived blizzards that might have killed them. Protected by engineering principles a widow had learned from her bridge builder father and implemented out of desperate maternal necessity. Margaret lived to see her grandchildren play beneath double-roofed cabins scattered across the northern frontier. Sarah, her eldest daughter, became a teacher who included basic engineering principles in her curriculum, shocking some parents, but producing students who understood how structures worked and why mathematics mattered. Emma married a carpenter and worked alongside him, designing buildings that incorporated advanced structural concepts. The phrase, "built like a Hayes roof," became frontier shorthand for construction that could withstand anything nature delivered. It appeared in advertisements, building contracts, and casual conversation. Most people using the phrase never met Margaret, never knew the full story of how a widow's desperate innovation had transformed frontier architecture. Margaret herself remained quietly proud of what she had accomplished, but she never sought recognition beyond her community. When the Milwaukee journalist returned in 1880 to write a follow-up article about her legacy, she declined to be interviewed. "I built a roof to keep my daughters alive," she told him. That it helped others was fortunate, but it was never about fame or credit. It was about survival. She died in 1893 at age 58, having lived long enough to see the frontier she had known transformed by railroads, telegraph lines, and permanent towns. Her double roof structure, the one neighbors had mocked and called foolish, stood until 1921, when the property was sold and the old cabin finally demolished to make way for a modern farmhouse. But by then, Hayes-style pavilion roofs had spread so widely across the northern territories that their origin story had become frontier folklore. Structural engineers in universities studied her designs, recognizing sophisticated understanding of load distribution and environmental adaptation. Architecture students learned about the Hayes roof as an example of vernacular engineering excellence. The impossible had become commonplace. A roof that could withstand a grizzly bear's full strength, as Samuel Bridger had engineered decades earlier in Montana, had its Wisconsin equivalent in a widow's double roof that could bear tons of snow without collapsing. Both innovations shared common elements: practical necessity driving creative engineering, personal tragedy motivating obsessive attention to survival, and knowledge applied with precision to solve problems that conventional wisdom could not address. Margaret Hayes proved that frontier innovation was not exclusively male territory, that desperation combined with knowledge could produce solutions traditional methods missed, and that sometimes the person mocked as foolish was simply seeing problems and solutions that others had not yet recognized. Her legacy was carved not in monuments or official records, but built into the timber and engineering of thousands of structures across the northern frontier, standing silent testament to what maternal determination and engineering knowledge could accomplish when circumstances demanded the impossible become real.